BLM protesters point to Breonna Taylor as an example of police brutality against Black Americans. During a controversial no-knock warrant, police busted into her apartment and shot her dead during an exchange of gunfire. Social media cried, "If she was white, this wouldn't have happened." Are they right? Hello out there. I am trying to get through.
With cold, blunt analysis, cradled in the warmth of reasoning, it's time for Johnny Walker Dread to straighten you out on a thing or two. Emanating all the way from exciting Las Vegas, Oklahoma, it's the Johnny Walker Dread Show.
Well, what we're going to do here is compare Breonna's shooting with one that occurred in Houston some years back that in many ways is very similar. To analyze this comparison, we need to consider what happened in both incidences, and we'll start with Breonna Taylor. Most of you already know about the shooting of Breonna Taylor, although there's a lot of misinformation out there on the incident, and I'm going to try to avoid contributing to that. The Breonna Taylor case wasn't initially about Breonna. Rather, the cops were after two of her acquaintances, Jamarcus Glover and Adrian Walker. Both were well-known drug dealers. Glover was Breonna's ex-boyfriend until she left him for a man named Kenneth Walker, who's not related to Adrian. The extent to which Breonna was involved in illegal activity is unclear. If she had cut ties with Glover, then she'd probably be alive today. Unfortunately, she didn't. At one point, Breonna even rented a car and loaned it to Glover. Later, the cops found a dead body in the car, who had apparently been shot by somebody else. We also know that Glover used Breonna to handle his drug money, although there is no proof that Breonna knew his connection to drugs. One thing is clear. Breonna's ex-boyfriend was knee-deep in some seriously bad things, and that Breonna maintained a close relationship with him after their breakup. She definitely knew about Glover's drug dealings, because she was the one he would call to bail him out of jail using the drug money she held for him. Again, there's no proof that she knew it was drug money. But if you're still of the opinion that she was an innocent lamb unlucky enough to be caught up in other people's crimes, consider the following from a report that detailed audio recordings of a phone conversation between Breonna Taylor and Glover. It says, but the recordings and other evidence reviewed by the Courier-Journal show Taylor and Glover maintained closer ties. On January 3rd, for example, following Glover's arrest on trafficking and weapons charges, he called Taylor from the jail and asked her to contact one of his co-defendants to get bail money. Taylor responded that the associate was, get this, already at the trap, slang for a house used for drug trafficking. Glover told her to be on standby to pick him up if he made bail. "I'm going to get me some rest in your bed," he said, according to the recording. "Love you," he said at the end of the call. "Love you too," she replied. At any rate, because of Breonna's relationship with Glover, cops requested a search warrant from a judge. The warrant itself is rather spotty, and some say borderline illegitimate. Rick Gore on his Good Luck America YouTube channel critiqued the search warrant and found it lacking. And I'll put a link to Rick's video in the description. And there is some evidence to suggest that the cops weren't exactly truthful in everything they told the judge. Whatever the case, they did receive the no-knock warrant and proceeded to bust into Breonna's apartment later that night. Kenneth Walker, who was with Breonna, exchanged gunfire with the police, and Breonna was shot and killed. However, there's a lot of confusion and misinformation on what happened there, so I may have gotten some things wrong. The cops have faced a multitude of charges and lawsuits over the incidents, but that's for another video. Strategic Eyes, in a recent panel discussion on my channel, talked about the evidence against Breonna Taylor that he researched, and in his view, Breonna was knee-deep in a lot of nefarious activities. I will post a link to that video in the description below as well. Oh, and subscribe to his channel. Subscribe to my channel. This would be a good time to do it. Come on, subscribe. Do the protesters against the police in the Breonna Taylor shooting have a reason to be angry? And well, perhaps. But let's compare now to a shooting that happened in Houston that is in most ways eerily similar and in most ways even worse. And remember, if Breonna was white, this wouldn't have happened. Regina Nicholas and Dennis Tuttle were having a normal evening in Houston, but a neighbor named Patricia Garcia, who had been feuding with them, decided to swat them. She calls up the Houston Police Department and told them that the couple were drug dealers who had been giving drugs to her daughter, and that they had a cache of machine guns in the home. The fact that Patricia didn't even have a daughter, well, that didn't seem to matter too much. A narcotics officer named Gerald Goins, who is black, I need to point that out because the race grifters have made race the central issue. He figured that Patricia's complaints weren't going to be enough to secure a warrant. What to do? What to do? Hey, suppose an informant could snitch on the couple by saying he bought drugs from them. Well, that would work. There was only one small problem. Goins didn't have such an informant, so he made him up. He takes completely fabricated testimony from an informant that doesn't exist to a judge who, not knowing any better, grants the no-knock warrant. With this illegal no-knock warrant in hand, the SWAT team busts into Dennis and Regina's home. A firefight breaks out. Or did it? More on that in a moment. The result is that the cops shot to death both Dennis and Regina, and their dog. Dennis had 9 bullet holes in him. One of those shot during the break-in was Gerald Goins, who sustained a modest injury to his arm. Let's all say about Gerald Goins getting hurt. Now, the police did find small amounts of drugs in the house. Nothing representing dealer quantities, though. And no machine guns. Later, Patricia Garcia... Garcia, is that a person of color? She would plead guilty for her role in creating the false police report that got Dennis and Regina killed in the first place. She would be sentenced to 40 months in a federal prison. I'll let you decide if you think that's enough. But back to the firefight. Apparently, the police's story that Dennis and Regina put up a fierce barrage of gunfire was, like everything else about this story, fabricated. Gunshot wounds sustained by the police were apparently by friendly fire. In fact, it appears that Dennis only got a few rounds off with a revolver. Regina didn't fire at all. Evidence also suggests that police outside the house fired blindly through the walls. Where did we hear that before? Well, that actually happened at the Biona Taylor shooting as well. What happened to Goins? Well, he's in a lot of trouble, facing 2 counts of felony murder. Another officer, Stephen Bryant, is also in deep shit for conspiring to help Goins cover up the whole phony informant story. For those that can only think in racial terms, do you notice anything? On a side note, if you're looking for body cam footage of the raid, you can stop, and no such footage exists. Can we now compare the 2 shootings? First, the obvious. Breonna Taylor was black, Nicholas and Tuttle were white. Both involved no-knock warrants. In the case of Taylor, the warrant was questionable and potentially illegal. In the case of Nicholas and Tuttle, the warrant was blatantly illegal. To make matters worse, it was precipitated by a person of color swatting them. Only Breonna was killed in her shooting, but the Harding Street raid, which, by the way, that's what they call it, the Harding Street raid, that claimed 2 lives and a dog. The evidence is strong that Breonna Taylor was no angel, although the extent of her involvement in drug trafficking is kind of unclear. There is no evidence to suggest that Nicholas and Tuttle were ever involved in any serious drug crimes beyond being users. So what can we conclude? Given that Regina and Dennis were white, you would think that the media would have blown this story up. After all, the media considers white people more valuable, right? Well, we can compare the coverage that the Harding Street shootings and Breonna Taylor shootings received through a Google search. So if we just type in Regina Nicholas, we get 9,220 results. Boy, that sounds like a lot. Now, let's see what happens when we type in Breonna Taylor. And when we do, we get 15.6 million. That means that for every post about Regina Nicholas, there are nearly 1,700 posts about Breonna Taylor. What about protests? Well, here's one, and look at all the people there. Do a search of images, and you will see there are tons of protests, some of them looking rather violent. What do we get when we look up Regina Nicholas for protests? Well, you get 4 pictures. 4. 2 of them are the same. Oh, I should say that this first one, that's actually a George Floyd protest, so actually only 3. We have here a little memorial with like 3 people in it. These 2 here were taken at a protest in Houston, and that is it. The police brutality against people of color myth is propagated by race hustlers like Benjamin Crump, Don King, and of course, Rashad Ritchie to drive a racial wedge among our population. These people thrive on bitterness and unhappiness. They knew of the Nicholas Tuttle killings, but they chose to bury the story. Gee, I wonder why. In truth, there is no reason to believe that race played any role in Breonna Taylor's death. And as proven with the deaths of Nicholas and Tuttle, it certainly isn't true that these incidences never happened to white people. It's also clear that the perceived unjustified killings of blacks garners far more media attention than if it happened to whites. So why do people buy into such propaganda? The answer is simple. A poor understanding of statistical sampling driven by a lack of education and substandard critical thinking skills. Simply put, we think that these events happen to black people more because the media is far more eager to publish their stories. This embitters the population even more, which in turn drives up more interest in publishing more of these stories. This is called selection bias, and in fact, the entire myth of police brutality against people of color is selection bias working overtime. Now, I know that some of you will say, well, you only showed one example of white people getting shot in a no-knock warrant. Well, we only have the one example of Breonna Taylor getting shot in a no-knock warrant. That one example was enough to go off and blame police for being racist. A sample size of 1 didn't bother them then, but now all of a sudden when you come up with a clear counterexample, all of a sudden sample size becomes important. Ultimately, they're just full of shit. The idea is that if Breonna Taylor was white, she wouldn't have been shot. This was an example of white privilege is completely blown up here. I provided a clear counterexample that disproves that myth. And keep in mind that the shooting of Dennis Tuttle and Regina Nicholas was worse than Breonna Taylor's shooting, for reasons I already explained. So tell me in the comments section, what do you think of these kind of videos? Would you like to see more of these? Because I got a whole bunch of them lined up. For every shooting of a black person that's got everybody up in arms, there's a similar one involving a white person that everybody ignored. Like my video, subscribe to my channel.